Hello and welcome to the show premiere of The Rambling Englishman. I'm your host, Mark Bullock, and I'll give you a quick background to the show and to myself, and we will then dive into today's show. So, I'm a British expat living in North Mississippi, and I've been in America now for 10 years. And over that time, I've noticed that on a not just a level in America, but in a wider sense, there's no longer a center of the road argument for many issues. You normally get the left, you normally get the right. There is no one that really stands there anymore and says anything about the argument from the center. In other words, looking at both sides of the argument and weighing up the pros and cons and seeing if there's any merits to either argument. So this was the idea behind the Rambling Englishman, because being a British expat living in America, and even when I go back home, I look objectively at most things, and I don't just, listen to what the news is telling me. Quite funny, actually, because I do actually own a local news network in North Mississippi. It's called TVMO News Network MS, and we pride ourselves on being unbiased, non-politically affiliated, and we thoroughly research our articles before we bring any out. So we're not just throwing stuff out there and, mismatching facts or whatever. And there's been quite a few times when we've actually beaten the bigger networks to the punch, so to speak. We've got the headlines. We've also got the inside scoop because we've got a lot of sources on a local and state and national level. And we've reported a lot of stories quicker and better than most more established, well-funded news outlets. So over time of talking to people, I have two sort of personalities, so to speak. I feel a bit bipolar when I say that. So I have my professional mentality where I am straight down the middle and don't have an opinion. Where, in a personal sense, I do not, even though I am a conservative at heart, or a Republican, as the Americans would say, I don't just look at the Republican argument all the time. I look at any situation, whether it's political or otherwise, from an outside point of view, and look at all aspects, look at the evidence, and all the facts, and go from there. So that's where the premise of this show, essentially lies, is looking at a multitude of issues. It's not just going to be news stories. It's going to be a lot of issues around the world and also in America, and give her a center of the road argument. It's not going to be everyone's cup of tea, as they say in the UK, but let's see if we can start to bring some normalcy back to the world, because it's one of those things where I've noticed over the years, I'm not as old as many, but I'm not as young as a few, where common sense on many arguments and many levels seems to be out the window. Like I was reading an article the other day where a guy had been arrested in, I think it was Kentucky, for posting memes of President Trump. I don't believe it was Secret Service led. I believe it was genuinely the local law enforcement that was very right-leaning. I believe it was the sheriff. Decided that this guy was wrong, arrested him, charged him, and then later dropped the charges because there was no evidence to charge the guy. So, there's a lot of political, a lot of political things in America right now, and even in the UK, that there's a lot of politics going on. But I just want to offer a layman's stand back, and just give a different perspective on cases and issues. So in today's show, we're actually going to focus on a big topic that's currently happening in DeSoto County in North Mississippi. And that is the case of Lindsey Whiteside. And for those that don't know, Lindsey Whiteside was a former youth pastor who recently admitted her guilt to the sexual battery of a minor whilst being in a position of authority or power or influence. And just to give a quick background, because I know a lot of people are confused about this, but in Mississippi there are two consent laws. One is if you are a normal everyday person, and I believe that's got a few caveats to it as well. I believe it is age 16 of consent in Mississippi, but I believe if the when you have sexual contact with someone, I believe if the person's 16 and the other person is over a certain age, I believe that's still classed as sexual battery or statutory rape. But there is another caveat to that law, and that is if you are in a position of influence, so a youth pastor, a newscaster, a politician, whatever, even a police officer, you are not allowed to engage in sexual activity with anyone under the age of 18. So that's what Lindsey Whiteside basically did. Is well, not just that. I mean, she did a lot more than that. And that's by her own volition. This is not me sitting there pointing fingers. This is by her own volition. She admitted, she went guilty to the sexual battery of a minor. And just to give you a bit of a background to the case, the victim, who was identified in court as MF, joined Get Well Church in Hernando, Mississippi with her family back in 2023. And at the time, the teenage girl, the victim, MF, was having a lot of trouble in her life. She was depressed. She was troubling with, she was troubled from trauma from a prior event in her life to do with her biological father, I believe. There was just a lot of stuff going on, and, more than normal teenagers go through. And so the mother and stepfather of the victim approached the church and said, is there some sort of help within the church? And they referred her, the young girl, to Lindsey Whiteside. Well, it appears, based on evidence presented in court and by Lindsey Whiteside's own volition, from the moment she first came into contact with a teenage girl, who at the time I think was about 15, maybe a little bit older, basically decided that she was going to have some sort of a sexual relationship with her one day. And so the grooming started from the first session. And I was one of the ones in court on the day when Lindsey Whiteside admitted her guilt. And Lindsey Whiteside done what they call an open guilty plea. So what that means is she admitted her guilt, but the prosecution and the defense could not come up with a suitable agreement on what punishment she should be given. So Lindsey basically threw herself at the mercy of a judge. Now, the judge that was selected was a guy called Andrew Howarth. He was a retired circuit court judge, and he basically comes out of retirement when there's a conflict of interest, because two of the judges within DeSoto County at the time, when the case was first put on the court docket, had some connection to either the victim or the defendant. So Judge Howarth was brought in from Oxford, which is in Lafayette County, which is just south of DeSoto County, and what was to happen in the courtroom was truly shocking. So I'll give you a rundown on that and then tell you about the public outcry. So Whiteside, as I said, admitted her guilt, and in the sentencing hearing, it doesn't have a jury. It's basically, as I say, it's just the judge, the prosecution, and the defense, along with supporters for or against. And due to the issues surrounding the Whiteside case, because there had been some security concerns, because a member of the public, I believe it's somehow connected to the victim, and there was several. I mean, it was a highly charged issue within DeSoto County, because you had on one side, you had a youth pastor who had abused their position and doing whatever they were doing, and then on the other side you had not much support, because the victim really couldn't talk in open settings about the level of abuse or anything like that until Whiteside was convicted. So you had a lot of misinformation, a lot of claims, a lot of, I wouldn't say lies, but just a lot of stuff going on. And so during the court hearing in early October of this year, 2025, that is, if this is someone listening at a later date, Lindsey Whiteside admitted her guilt, and the victim was the first person to speak, and the victim gave a very compelling insight into the level of grooming, to a point that she had admitted, well, not admitted, but she had basically outlined how Whiteside, from day one, from the first moment they came into contact on their first counselling session, had groomed the young girl to, and start to isolate her from her friends and peers and everything else, and that was it. That was that's the typical predatory behaviour. And Whiteside then, as the young girl, well, the teenage girl, got older, by the May of 2024, that's when the sexual relationship started, and by that point the victim was completely captivated by Whiteside. She was so ingrained in her life, it was unbelievable. And that's, the family of the victim just saw it as, a youth pastor, trying to really help a teenager who's really struggling. But it later turned out, when the mother looked at the young girl's phone the one day, she saw some very suspicious text messages, and I'll come on to that in a minute. And basically, you know, a sexual relationship started, and Whiteside abused her position of trust, and then it, you know, spiraled to where when the family of the victim became aware of it, they went to the church. And it's quite confusing to what happened from there. The church either did their own investigation or whatever, but it took them several days apparently to get to law enforcement. Whiteside was immediately dismissed once she had admitted her guilt, and then, you know, there was a lot of to and fro-in. And Whiteside is from a family of means, as many people say. She comes from money. Her grandfather apparently is a well-respected, or was a well-respected pastor. With it, you know, and within North Mississippi, and Mississippi in general, you know, it's a very, you know, there's a lot of people that go to church still on a Sunday and are very church orientated. So people who are pastors and that are still, you know, highly placed in society. Well, during the, you know, you've got this victim who sits on the stand and gives a very compelling insight to what went on. The level of abuse, the level of grooming and everything. And it was quite sickening to sit there and listen to at some points. And you had the victim's family then spoke to the mother and stepfather. And this is how crazy the case got. Whiteside was supported by at least 10 teachers from DeSoto County schools, a former police chief, and a member of a school board, along with 40-odd other people, or 30-odd other people, who had all, you know, written letters to the judge, you know, basically saying, you know, she's a really good girl, you know, please don't punish her too much, that sort of thing, you know, really giving Whiteside. But these aren't just people that you would bump into in the street, you know, these are people in a position of authority, or used to be in a position of authority, so their opinion really does count. And it seemed from my perspective in the courtroom that as the evidence was being given by the victim, a lot of people who were supporting Lindsey Whiteside in the courtroom were utterly shocked at what they were hearing. It appeared that, based on some remarks made within the prosecution's opening statements and throughout some of their statements, it seems that Whiteside had initially told people, or there was a story going around at least, that the charges come from a few questionable text messages, nothing more, nothing less. But as the victim sat on the stand, you know, giving this very compelling insight into the level of grooming and abuse, a lot of people were just in utter shock. And so after the victim, you know, the prosecution put their arguments forth, and everyone was asking for 30 years. The prosecution then brought up a member of the school board who had written a letter of support for Lindsey Whiteside. And this is where the case really got shocking. You've got a respected member of the school board who sits on a witness stand giving support of now a self-confessed sexual predator. After listening to the victim give their evidence, and at the time of the abuse, the victim was actually a student within the DeSoto County school system. And the prosecutor, DA Matthew Barton, had basically asked the school board member if they would like to recant their letter based on what they'd just heard from the victim. And what came next was one of the most shocking things I've ever seen, because the school board member is called Michelle Henley, and without emotion, without any type of anything, I mean, it was just plain, she said no. I mean, she sat there and listened to a girl, a victim, give some very sickening insights to the level of abuse that was inflicted upon her. And this school board member, in effect, didn't see anything wrong with it. That's basically, you know, from my standpoint, and this is purely my standpoint, the way that I look at it is, if you allow that letter to go forward, you support that case. And honestly, if that was me, sat on the stand, I would have withdrawn the letter straight away. And it progressed on, you know, the DA was asking her why she wrote the letter, and basically it turned out that Henley stated that her daughter knew Whiteside, and she was writing it because her daughter asked her to. And I sat there, you know, thinking at the time, if Michelle Henley's daughter asked her to jump off a cliff, then I'm almost certain she probably would, according to that analogy. I mean, genuinely, I mean, if you're sat on the stand, you are defending a now self-confessed sexual predator, you're being asked to recant a letter, and you say no. That really is shocking. The next person that came up on the stand, sorry, not the next person, but the family members of Whiteside also spoke. But then a current or a former teacher, as it is now, came up and took the stand on behalf of Lindsey Whiteside, and literally gave some crazy statements. She made it known that Lindsey Whiteside had slept on her couch for 12 months. She'd done this, she'd done that, but she's a really good person. There was nothing wrong with her. And she also started to do what they call victim shame. So she's basically started to point fingers at the victim, saying it was partly her fault, this, that, and the other. And this person's name is Ashley Ford, and she literally was an educator in DeSoto County at the time. And within days of the court case, Ashley Ford resigned or was removed from teaching within DeSoto County. But they couldn't remove Michelle Henley because she's an elected official, and in Mississippi there is no recall laws. So unless Michelle Henley resigns willingly, then she is staying put. Well, at the end of the case, the judge then decided that he's now heard enough. He's now going to sentence. And what came next is what really caused the controversy. It wasn't just the fact that educators and all sorts of prominent people have stood up for her, for Lindsey Whiteside, and not for the victim. But the judge sentenced Lindsey Whiteside to 3 years house arrest, with 7 years of supervision after that. And a lot of people in the local area felt that this was unjustified, and rightly so. I mean, it's when you look at the whole bigger picture, Whiteside groomed a teenager, and that led to a sexual relationship. And, it was wrong. It is wrong. And she should be punished with a custodial sentence, not, staying at home and being allowed out on weekends. And it seems the judge actually never really did any foresight and planning before imposing this sentence. Because, there is another twist to this case, which you'll see in a moment. And basically, Whiteside was unable to actually get anyone to sign off on the address in an official sense, because it's right by school. So he's literally now, you've got a sexual predator who's not allowed to be within whatever the set distance is from a school, literally given an address to stay at right by school. So after this, the public were very, very upset. TVMO, my news outlet, published a lot of articles on this, and it caused a movement, and it really did. I mean, you had parents, and rightly so, they were just so up in arms. And it's they did a school walkout. They basically got Ashley Ford removed from her job. Because Ashley Ford was questioned after the case by her principal, the school she's at. And it seems that Ashley Ford had lied profusely to her boss and said, I didn't say this, I didn't say that. Well, TVMO were in the room, boys and girls, so we're going to let the cat out of the bag, so to speak, and we're really going to throw it out there. Henley pretty much has been dragged through it. Her reputation is disgraced. There is another name which I'll mention momentarily. A guy that by the name of Macon Moore, who was a former police chief of the South Haven Police Department in DeSoto County, who was subpoenaed to the stand, but he never turned up. And there's a lot of people now questioning him why he's not been prosecuted for that, because if it was anyone else, surely, it would have been some sort of repercussions. Well, the DA was not very happy with the outcome, so he made it known that he was going to refer the case to the federal authorities, and that's where the case is now. Lindsey Whiteside is now in federal custody, pending a suitable address to bond out to. The federal prosecutors are actively trying to stop her from being released. Her trial on a federal level happens on December the 8th, I believe, of this year. Now, this is the point of the show. Is I've not really presented out all the evidence because there is a lot. I mean, I'd be sat here for an hour just presenting the evidence. In fact, probably longer than that, because the court hearing when Whiteside on a state level went guilty, it was like nearly 5 hours. So there was a lot of evidence presented. So I've just given it in a nutshell. But the crux of it all is Whiteside has admitted her guilt. Okay. Now, the defense attorneys for Lindsey Whiteside are very skilled advocates. They are a very well-known law firm in Mississippi. The guy that defended her on the state level was a guy called Whit Cooper. I really don't know Whit Cooper, but from seeing him in court, he seems to be a very sharp and intelligent individual, like most attorneys are. Very well presented, very methodical. But now the case has progressed to a federal level. I actually do know, I wouldn't say really well, but I do know the attorney that's now representing her from the same law firm. I think he's actually the senior partner. His name's Tony Farese. And Tony's a really good guy, actually. And what people have got to understand is that people like Tony, as a defense attorney, has a job to do. Rightly or wrongly, it's how he earns money. It's a business. And if you start turning people away in business, it doesn't do good for any. It doesn't provide an income. So, defense attorneys can't pick and choose the cases they take. In some senses, they can, but let's be honest. If you start turning cases away, you're not going to you're not going to be in business very long. And the Freese law firm out of Ashland, Mississippi, and also Oxford, I know they've got a branch down there. They are highly rated. Seriously, they are a very good law firm. One of the best, I would say, actually, in Mississippi. And that's who Lindsey Whiteside's defense is. And, this is where the whole, people are looking at this now that Lindsey Whiteside got 3 years house arrest because she's a white woman with money. And, a lot of people are starting to call this, rich white people's justice. And that pretty much is, from my point of view, that is the crux of this, is that Lindsey Whiteside is a rich white woman, or at least comes from a very affluent family, from what everyone states and from what we can see in the public domain. And she has got a very sharp law firm behind her. As I said, the Freese law firm out of Ashland is a very, very good law firm. They are, as I said, probably one of the best in Mississippi. And, it's just, a lot of people are not happy with the sentence, and rightly so. Because when you look at it, this is the whole thing, is that you've got this good woman who's sentenced to 3 years house arrest, and now the federal charges have actually opened up a bigger can of worms, because the judge from the state case actually recused herself because the DA's office has asked for a resentencing on a state level, but also it's now progressed to so there's a lot of legal background to this. As I say, for me to go through it all would take hours on end. But this is just the crux of the case. This is just the big facts. So now we're at a federal level, and on a federal level, there's 3 charges against Whiteside. 2 are crossing a state line with a minor for the purposes of sexual acts, and 1 is related to basically coercing the victim into crossing state lines. Now, this is where things get really interesting, because Lindsey Whiteside has pled not guilty. Now, on the stand, the victim did recount a time when she was sexually assaulted by Whiteside whilst on a church bus, and also whilst on the same bus that was taking him to this trip, on the same trip. Now, this is this is where the whole alternate dimension comes from, because Tony Farese, the lead attorney for Whiteside now on a federal level, made a statement the other day outside the courthouse at the preliminary hearing in Oxford, and basically said this is un-American. She's already been charged with it. This is just a prosecutor crying over spilt milk. And in some respects, it is a prosecutor crying over spilt milk. But also, it's the public that are now sitting there saying this isn't right. The public are genuinely coming out in their droves, and seeing that it's a group of rich people banding together. And honestly, from the outside looking in, that's how it appears. But even from the inside looking out, that's again what it is. Because when you look at the people that support Whiteside, they are business owners. They are pillars of the community, or were pillars of the community. Their reputations, a lot of people, are now in tatters. They are no longer seen as these, clean-cut individuals. They are now the scum of the earth. especially when you get a school board member sitting there refusing to recant a letter. And again, I mean, the whole letter thing is another fiasco. I mean, there was 49 people that wrote a letter in support of Whiteside, why she shouldn't go to prison, and the judge obviously listened to these letters because of the people that wrote them, and the judge took the unprecedented step. Well, not unprecedented, but he took a step to basically seal the letters, and he did that for security reasons, for safety reasons, because again, this case is very, very provoking within the local community. I mean, it is. There's it's like the courtroom. You literally had to be on a list to go into a courtroom, because if you weren't, you weren't getting in, because it was, there were security concerns. There were threats made, not just against Whiteside, but also there were some issues with the victim. So, you've got a lot of dimensions to this, and now we're at a federal level, and this is where people get lost in the moment. The role of a prosecutor is to prove someone's guilt. And that is the law of the land in America. In other parts of the world, it's different. It's up to the defendant to prove their guilt. But the prosecutor's job is to prove someone's guilt, where a defense attorney, their job is to defend their client. Now, whether they are a run-of-the-mill, court-appointed attorney that, is just getting paid a bare-bones check, or someone, such as Tony Farice, who's being paid by the defendant's family or whoever to defend him. These people, that do this job, it's a job to them. And that's what people have got to remember, is that on both sides of the divide, these people are just doing a job. And if you don't agree with it, that's fine. But actively attacking people for doing their job, it doesn't matter. It shouldn't happen. It's, as I said, the prosecutor has the joy of being employed by the government. I mean, not at the moment, because they're probably not being paid because of the government shutdown. But when you are in business for yourself, and I can attest to that, you need to make a living. If you do not make a living, how are you going to support yourself? And some people just don't want to work for some other people. They really don't. Like, I'm in a position where I don't want to work for anyone else. I would sooner work for myself. So with that, I do a lot of projects on the back end that people don't see. And on the front end with the social media stuff, with the podcast and everything else, it just helps top up my income. So, and it's a bit of fun as well, especially when I do the cold case stuff or the crime reporting. And that's what TVMO was. It was just a way to another news avenue. But people have got to understand that in this case, it is the attorneys have a job to do, and that's all it is to them. Whoever defends her, whether the Farice law firm carries on defending her, or another law firm has to come in, whatever. But it's all about a strategy as well. And this is where the Farices, from my opinion, come into their own, because they are very good at strategy. And it's like I live in the same area as Tony Farice, and I always remember first of all being told about Tony Farice, and he was described to me as a true Southern gentleman who was immaculately dressed, well groomed, and I remember seeing him for the first time. I think it was on a Facebook picture, and they weren't far wrong with their description. And I've also seen Tony practice in a courtroom defending someone, and the guy is good. I mean, his strategy, and that's what it all comes down to, is now strategy. But this is where this point comes from now, is, these statements are being made, and a lot of people are up in arms, and, the prosecution have a job to do to prove the guilt and say, hey, she's done this, she crossed state lines to do this. But on a strategy point, this could all turn, because at least one of these charges from a federal level relate to a church trip. So is this case going to be turned on its head, and the church are going to be implicated in some respects? Because, let's think about it. Whiteside came into contact with the victim via the church, okay? And the church had been very silent. They put out a statement shortly after the trial. There were several people in the courtroom that were from the church. The church had never publicly came out and supported anyone. There was a pastor apparently in the room to support the victim, but they was that far removed from the victim. They may as well stood outside the courtroom. In fact, the media were closer to the victim than this pastor was. because the DA's office did a very good job of keeping this victim very secure in the state level proceedings. But yeah, you've now got to look at this as a bigger picture, and that's that there's a new strategy coming in, because when you look at the weight of the law, okay, and the wording of the law, and this is where good attorneys really come from, is, from my opinion, my humble opinion, I'm not an attorney, and this is not legal advice, but it seems that most good attorneys look at the wording of a law, and that is where they sway a jury. And they say, okay, you may be saying that this person did this for this, but the letter of the law states this. So in other words, everything is interpretation. And that's what the defense has got to do, is basically interpret this in their own way and convince a jury that they are right and that the federal government are wrong for bringing this charge. Because in a sense, Whiteside has been, no matter how light the sentence was, and my personal opinion is she should have been given a custodial sentence. When you look at the mitigating facts, was 30 years acceptable? Based on the level of grooming and abuse, because grooming started when the victim was about 15. That alone should be an automatic 10 years. Just that alone, just that alone, in my opinion. And then the level of abuse thereafter, because there were times when Whiteside had plied this girl with drink and stuff like that. So for every, the way that I would look at it, if I was a judge, I would look at the bare bones and apply a common sense method to it and say, okay, we'll give her 10 years for this, and for each subsequent act of how grievous it was, we will have brackets. We'll have guidelines, and I'll have my own levels, and we get to this point. And if it turns out the total number is 30 years, we'll give her 30 years. If the total number is 25, we'll give her 25. But it should be somewhere in the range of, in my opinion, of about 15 to 25 years. And mostly in Mississippi, if I remember right, I think that's day for day. I don't know if that would be applied to that. But yeah, it's one of those things where you've got to sit there and you've really got to listen to the public on this one. And 3 years house arrest and 7 years supervision really isn't a justifiable sentence. It is completely asinine and wrong. But we're no longer in a federal sentencing state guidelines now. We're now in federal, and this is because a lot of people have the DA has drawn a factor that the sexual battery of a minor in the state of Mississippi is classed as a violent offence. So that basically means house arrest is off the table. It has to be a custodial sentence by law. And I know people are going to be shouting at me now from the rooftops and saying that I'm wrong with what I'm saying, but this is my opinion. If you don't like it, turn it off. I really don't care. Everyone's got their opinions. And opinions are like assholes. Everyone's got one. But and that's the reality of it. We're all adults, and if you cannot be an adult in this situation, then there really is no room for you at the table. Go and sit with the kids, because that's how you're acting. Some people, it's like protesting Whiteside's employment at Norton. Yes, that is justified. I agree, because it should be brought to everyone's attention, because kids work at that store. Kids go in that store, and Whiteside has literally just admitted that she is a sexual predator. That's what she's done. On a state level, she has admitted it. On a federal level, she hasn't. She's gone not guilty. And as I say, this is where the strategy comes into it. And the church, I think, are going to be thrown under the bus on this one. And I mean, that's a horrible term to use, because the victim was sexually assaulted on a bus at one point. But yeah, I mean, literally the church. Is the driver going to be held accountable? Because technically he's the one that transported her. Whiteside couldn't have been driving the bus because she was abusing the victim. So is this really going to end up... Because the church really haven't been brought into the limelight. The school district, DeSoto County School District, that, there are claims that Lindsey Whiteside was a assistant basketball coach. But she may have been a volunteer assistant coach, but she certainly wasn't on the payroll of DeSoto County Schools. And she is literally... and DeSoto County Schools have been put through it, and that's mainly because of the teachers that supported Whiteside and the school board member. But Whiteside never worked for the school district officially. She may have been a volunteer, but that's about as far as it goes. But so back on track. So which way is this really going to go? Is the defense going to play a strategy where they look at it and say, okay, this is how we do it. This is, Whiteside may have committed the abuse, which she's admitted to, but she didn't physically transport the victim. The driver did that. So do they now charge the driver? And how liable are the church? I mean, on a criminal level, you cannot sue a company, but you can on a civil level. So is this going to end up bankrupting the church? Because technically now the victim, because of Whiteside, has admitted her guilt and can sue the church. That there, and I don't think they will. But there is that option on the table now, because there should have been. It's like when I looked at when I was sat there listening to the victim give their testimony. I'm not a religious person. I'm not a regular churchgoer. I've been to several churches in the local area. I deal with a lot of people that do go to the churches within the local area. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of these gossips, church gossips as I call them, they've got better intelligence than most of the intelligence agencies around the world. These curtain twitchers, as I call them, really would put a lot of spies to shame, because these girls and guys really do get the gossip. So I find it hard to believe that there was not one person within Get Well Church that didn't have a suspicion of what was going on. They're just, the victim even sat on the stand and stated that, at one point Lindsey Whiteside's own mother told Whiteside to stay away from the victim, and this is before the charges even come about, and let her, get her own friends of her own age. Whiteside evidently never listened, and she just continued doing what she was doing. And when it all came to light and genuinely, I mean, it was the victim's mother that picked her phone up the one day and just happened to see some stuff. And when law enforcement got a warrant to dump the young girl's phone, or get a data dump, where they basically extract all the deleted text messages from an internal server owned by the network operator, there was 64,000 pages worth of text messages. And then it transpired that the young girl was told by Whiteside that every evening she was to delete her text messages between them. It was just, the case is so heinous, and the charge and the sentence was so light on a state level. As I said, there are mitigating circumstances for most crimes. Even if it's car theft. And there are some crimes that do not dictate a custodial sentence. Going out and I don't know, as a kid smashing a window, your first time in trouble, you really shouldn't get a custodial sentence. But genuinely, there are people in DeSoto County, and this is the argument, is that Lindsey Whiteside is a rich white woman, or comes from a rich white family, so she's not being penalised as much as she should have been. And that genuinely is the way it looks. And, it's rich white justice at play. And this isn't the only case. I mean, there's several cases that have been brought to my news agency's attention that we will be covering in the coming weeks. Probably not on the talk show, because I don't think it'll be conducive. But, it's this whole case. It's just so crazy. I mean, first of all, there is no way that no one in that church knew what was going on, or at least had an inkling of what was going on. Secondly, it's now on a federal level, and where is the case going to end? Is this going to be a master stroke by the defense, who are going to say, hey, technically, yes, she did sexually assault that child across state lines, but she didn't physically transport her. And then that brings a culpability for the driver and the church and everything else. And that's all. And this is just going to end in a big mess. It really is shocking. Are the federal government going to be made to look like idiots? I mean, seriously, are the federal government on this case going to be made to look like idiots? And that's because they could do. I'm not saying that they are, but when you look at because again, a lot of people are getting lost in the moment, and they're saying she's guilty. She is guilty. She's admitted her guilt on a state level, but not on a federal level, because it's the terminology, the way the law is written, which is what may get her off. And as I said, the Freest Law Firm are very good defense advocates. I mean, they are very good at what they do. And I mean, they've been in business a long time, and they've got some tricks up their sleeve which a lot of people don't use. They've got some tricks up their sleeve which are, honed over years of practicing the law. And it all, and if you look at any big flash attorney, it's like the O.J. Simpson case. That's how old I am. I can remember that. I was only a kid at the time, but I remember it. And even in the UK, it was a big thing. I remember the Bronco chase, and even every news channel in the UK, not just every news channel, but because back then I think we only had 3 or 4 channels in the UK, but every channel cut to it. I mean, literally that live feed was in the UK as well. When that Bronco chase was going on, it was but the defense of O.J. Simpson basically rested on a glove. It really did. And I believe it was Johnny Cochran that said, if it doesn't fit, you've got to acquit. Because they'd figured out that if O.J. Simpson didn't take his certain medication, his hands swelled up. So they basically stopped him from taking medication for a few days, and lo and behold, when he tried to put the glove on, it didn't fit. So, Johnny Cochran was very good at saying if it doesn't fit, you've got to acquit. And even to this day, it's a saying now. It's a household saying. It was it wasn't anything that Johnny Cochran was a good attorney because he knew how to read the law, and that's what it comes down to. Is a good attorney is good at what they do because they know how to basically turn the law to their advantage if they have to. Just because the law says this, it's the wording of the law, and that's where a lot of good attorneys, as I say, in my opinion, get really get people off or get them lighter sentences because they read the law and they say, okay, yes, you are going guilty, but interpreting it this way, and if they put a valid argument across to a judge or a jury, O.J. Simpson trial, prime example. And that's another thing with the Whiteside case. There is a lot of people that's bringing in a racial aspect. And this is the funny thing, is I agree that in some parts of Mississippi, I have seen some egregious sentences handed down to black people, and wrongly. I mean, yes, they did commit the crime, and it was their first or second offense, whatever. But then you look at the same sort of case outline of a white person, and they genuinely get a lighter sentence. And it's just crazy. But then there again, when you look at rich and poor, again, there's the same disparity. You've got a rich person, ergo Lindsey Whiteside, who literally sexually assaults a teenager for several months, grooms her and everything, and gets 3 years house arrest with 7 years supervised visits. Supervised by court. Then you get a teacher, so pastor teacher, same sort of thing, same sort of standing in society, in my opinion, who does the same sort of thing to a female student, and she gets 20 years. The disparity just there, and that's where the public uproar is coming out. It's not the fact that Lindsey Whiteside was convicted of it or anything. It's the sentence she was given, and that's why the DA elevated it to the federal courts, because it was like, well, chances are in the state system, she ain't going to get much different. So let's up the ante. They cross state lines, because that's the law. It's transporting the minor across state lines. Technically, on a technicality, and I hate to say this, but on a technicality, Lindsey Whiteside did not physically transport that minor on at least one of the events, because the victim, under their own admission, stated that she was sexually assaulted on a coach on a church trip heading to the destination. It's physically impossible for Whiteside to drive the vehicle and sexually assault a child on the bus at the same time. So the bus had a driver. So is the driver now going to be held liable for what Whiteside did? Because technically they are the ones that transported on the request of the church. So was a church going to be brought into this case, even more so than before? And that really is the way it's looking. I mean, honestly, when you look at it's transporting a minor. Now, is there a definition of where, you are transporting them to a place? Technically, did Whiteside transport them to the destination? Yes and no. She was on the bus, but she wasn't driving the bus. So it's a fine line here, and that's what people are missing. Is the Freese is going to pull a rabbit out of the hat at the 11th hour and say, hey, look, this is the law. So you cannot convict based on this statute alone, because she didn't transport her. No, there may be a case where there was one charge she did, but if everything was connected to church trips, there's a good chance that Whiteside wasn't driving that bus. So there's a good chance that Whiteside, because she's got not guilty on a federal level, and you look at it, why would a defense attorney, look at it realistically, why would a defense attorney tell their client to go guilty on a state level, but not on a federal level? Because the federal punishment is far superior than a state level. Do you see what I mean? It's attorneys that are worth their salt don't do that, and trust me, the phoresis are worth their salt. So it's one of those things where you look at it and you're like, there's a game plan here that no one's looking at. It's a big game plan, and it's going to be turned on its head. But the question is, who's going to be liable? Who's going to be left holding the charge on this one? Is it going to be Lindsey Whiteside, or is it going to be, the church or the driver of the bus? Because that really is the crux of everything: is the transportation of a minor to a destination for sexual, for sexual abuse. Now, the coercing, that one may stand because the child, the victim may not have wanted to go on the trip initially, and Whiteside coerced her to go. So they, that may stand. But again, I mean, they're big charges, and they carry a lot of time. I think they're like 10 years apiece. 3 charges, 10 years apiece at the bottom level. She gets sentenced at the bottom level. That's 30 years. Technically they're probably run concurrent. So basically they run together. So she'd serve 10 or whatever the federal mandate is. I think it's like 85% of their sentence. So 8.5 years should be out. Or, if she gets concurrent. It basically means, consecutive. So consecutive, she would serve one sentence and another, then another, then another. So she wouldn't be out for, 25 years. So, there's a lot of aspects that a lot of people have not looked at. And I've seen a lot of social media people jumping on this one, and rightly so, because the public outcry is there, and the sentiment is well justified. But they're just looking at the papers. They are just looking at, this is what it says. This is what Lindsey Whiteside's charged with. But if you look at it from a different dimension, that's what the point of this podcast is: looking at everything from a different dimension. Because technically she's already pled guilty, so that's a weight of evidence in its own. Because this is the masterstroke. In the prosecutor's summing up, or somewhere in the case, or I vaguely remember it. It's called a sentencing statement or something like that. So basically, the prosecutor will write a statement and read it out in court, and this is what the suspect is admitting to, and this is what they're pleading guilty to, openly or with a deal. In Whiteside's case, it was openly, and in there it did say transporting a minor across state lines. So technically, on that front alone, Whiteside has admitted her guilt. Does that guilt extend to a federal courtroom? Who knows? Evidently, her attorneys, who are very good at what they do, are saying no, it doesn't. She's admitted it on a state level. She's been punished for it. Technically, she has been punished for it. Rightly or wrongly, whatever the sentence is, she has been punished for it. So, so she's technically been punished for it, and it's one of those things where is that what this defense is all about now? Is she's admitted her guilt to this heinous crime, and on a state level she's been sentenced. So why are the federal government now doing it? Is this just a witch hunt? Is this just one more crack at Whiteside, and this shouldn't be happening? The judge is the one that should deal with this on a state level, because as I say, the state charges carry a more severe penalty than on federal charges, because on a state level you've got I think the maximum is 30 years. On a federal level, it's life. And again, as there's different brackets, and there's different factors which have to determine into this. Such as, is this a second strike? Well, technically no, because it's the same incident. It's just it's tied to another incident. Same incident, just different charging mechanisms. And this is one thing that's always baffled me about America is in the UK and other parts of the world, cases like this would get referred to in the UK. It's called a Crown Court. There is no, the magistrates, which is comparable to state level, don't deal with stuff like this. They pass it on into the Crown, and you go there, and if the sentence is too lenient, the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, can refer it to themselves to their own internal body, and they do on occasion. That there are cases in the UK that judges have sat on. and they have referred, the CPS have referred their own cases to the judges panel, and basically what that is I think it's 3 or 4 judges, the review commission, who will then sit there and look at the sentence, look at the facts, and they can increase the sentence or decrease it based on what they feel. And again, it happens in the UK as well, where you get rich people who have got the money to pay for the legal teams, and they get very light sentences because their attorneys, are very good at reading the law, interpreting the law, and convincing the jury of how it works. Just like in anything, you get what you pay for. You get what you pay for, and if you go out and buy a $3,000 second-hand car that's 50 years old, there's a chance it may break down within the next 6 to 8 months. But if you go out and you spend $50,000 on a brand new car, technically it shouldn't, unless if there's a serious manufacturer's defect, and then you don't pay for it. That's the manufacturer who pays for it. So, there's a lot of variables within this case that not many people are looking at. That they're all caught up in the moment, as I would say, and they're not looking at the bigger picture, and it's just, on my standpoint, I'm looking at this, and it's sort of like, it's quite interesting to see how the legal mechanisms work within the US, because as I say, in the UK and the rest of Europe and the Western world, it works a lot differently. A county level court, so to speak, deals with civil matters. The magistrates deal with all criminal cases, but if it's too much of a severe case, it automatically gets, once the preliminary hearing's been taken into account, it then gets referred to the Crown Court, which is more of your federal courts. That's a way to describe it. And again, our judges are not elected. Our police chiefs are not elected. Because again, this is another fiasco in the Lindsey Whiteside saga. There was a witness called on the stand called Macon Moore, a former police chief of South Haven Police Department in DeSoto County. Prior to that, he was the senior chief deputy of DeSoto County Sheriff's Department. And when he was subpoenaed, it comes from the Sheriff's Department, and yet he didn't turn up. He gave a verbal agreement that he would be there, but he didn't turn up. Now, if that was an ordinary everyday person, the question is, would they face some sort of ramifications or some sort of punishment for not turning up? Macon Moore didn't. We made a big article about it. With the company he works for, they have a lot of law enforcement contracts, and a lot of people are now looking at this saying, is Macon Moore being protected by that, that Blue Brotherhood? And this is why there's a lot of animosity, I think, as well, towards law enforcement in some respects, is because it seems like they cover for their own every now and again. Okay, Macon Moore, he didn't go out and murder someone. He just basically didn't turn up for a case, to give evidence. And that's basically, he pretty much guessed what was going on. It's like he there's rumors circulating that he didn't know the full gravity of the case until after it came out in court. And it's sort of like, hang on, you spent 30-odd, I think it was like 20-odd years he spent as a police officer, and you didn't pick up a phone once before you wrote the letter of support for her and ask your old colleagues, hey, what did she actually do? What's that case file saying? And people saying that doesn't happen. Oh, it does, quite a few times. We get a lot of exposure to law enforcement in the media, and you'll be surprised how these people talk behind closed doors. And they do talk to their own, retired or serving, it doesn't matter. So there's a lot of things which, with the Whiteside case, which has got a lot of people upset, and rightfully so in a lot of respects, because there is a lot of things which need to change. It's like these school teachers who have written letters for a self-confessed sexual predator. Because that's what Lindsey Whiteside now is. She is a self-confessed sexual predator. And she will be, I believe she's on the sex offenders register on a state level for the rest of her life. And whatever the federal authorities do to her, if she gets prosecuted and she gets found guilty, she will also be on a federal one, which I think they would combine them. I don't know how the sex offenders register works in the US. I know they have them on a state level. I don't know if they have them on a federal level. I'd imagine they probably do. But, it's just, this case has just been so crazy to watch and to sit and be an observer. It truly is. It's like, it's sort of, especially this new dimension to it with the federal courts. As I described Tony Faris, I think I'm pronouncing his name right. um, being described as a quintessential Southern gentleman. He's more akin at this point to a Southern general fighting the Federal, fighting the Yankees, because that's really what it's like right now. And there's a lot of statements being made, and when even the judge from the state level recused himself. He basically said he didn't want any part of it. Anything going forward because the DA's office have asked for a resentencing on the state level, and I think that's now got to wait until the federal level goes through. It's just a whole hotbed of a mess, and there's a lot of questions being asked, not many answers coming forward, and this is where the public are filling that void. There's a lot of members of the public who, as I said, they're doing a very good thing of exposing everything, but they're looking at one aspect of the argument. They're not looking at both sides, because it's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to sit there, and I'll say it openly. To make this podcast was one of the hardest ones I've ever done, because I do not agree with what Lindsey Whiteside did. I do not agree with that in general. Full stop. It's a no-no. My grandmother used to say, you can never put the innocence of a child back, and in this case, it's true. I've covered stories before with TVMO when it's been sexual offences, but never actually sat in the courtroom until the Whiteside case. And that was, someone actually who was sat behind me on the victim side, did send me a private message saying that they could see how repulsed I was by the whole thing. Just sitting there listening to the victim going on about the grooming and everything else. It was horrible. You've got a young girl who's on the stand who's, she's a teenager, a young lady now. I believe she's just turned 18. Describing what happened to her in a sexual sense in a public setting. That's not easy for anyone to do, and she bravely sat on that stand, and now she's got to do it again. And I give kudos to the victim in all of this, because she's got everything she went through the first time, and the DA's office were very good at protecting her. The way the court worked, I've done videos on this. Basically, we, the laymen's, the supporters of, we weren't a supporter, we were impartial observers, came in, sat down before the victim even came in. In fact, the victim came in after the judge came in. And the DA's office did a very good job of making sure she was well taken care of that day. We, as members of the media, got to see the victim's reaction to everything, because we were literally 12 foot from her. Probably a bit more than that, probably 20 foot. But we saw every twist and turn of the dagger, so to speak, the metaphorical dagger when things were being said. And the look on that young girl's face was utterly appalling. It was, she was ran through it. And, it's just one of those things where when you do things like this, it's horrible. It really is. It's, and this girl's got to go through it all again, and she's got to sit there on the stand and recount, these, the two charges of transporting across the border was Georgia and Tennessee. So she's got to go and relive that, those two moments, and describe to either a jury or a judge or however this one's going to work. Again, I don't know too much on the federal level. I am starting to research it, so everything's, I know what's going on. But yeah, it's the Whiteside case in one sense. There's a lot of public outcry, which is rightfully so, because of the lenient sentence she was given. And then in another respect, there's there's a lot of things which wasn't done right. But then, as I said, it's down to the skill of the advocate, the skill of the attorney on the day. And when you bring in the big guns, that they fire artillery shells. These are the phrases are known as a very good, they've got a very good reputation. They're hard hit, they're big hitters, and they're just good at what they do. And it's what someone described to me the other day as a rich white person's justice or something like that. And it really does seem like that. And I may do another podcast on this, on the Whiteside thing. And this is not me jumping on the bandwagon, because we've covered it, since the court case. We did know about it prior to the court case, but we didn't want to roll the masses, because genuinely, it was a hot topic for a very long time. And we wanted to not inflame the situation. But after the court case, there was no way you couldn't. I mean, you literally everything, even now. I mean, even weeks after, people are still, trying to wrap their mind around the sentence handed down. And as I say, it's down to the judge. It's not down to the prosecution. It's not down to the defense. That one's solely down to the judge. Now it's waiting to see what the federal judge does, and it's waiting to see what happens. I mean, it's going to be as I say, she's gone not guilty. Whiteside has gone not guilty in this case on a federal level, and her attorneys are no idiots, and so they've got some sort of game plan. As I said, I mean, are they going to try and look at this on a technicality? Are they going to say, hey, she technically didn't transport her, or the church is now culpable. So technically, you can't criminalize a company. It's only on a civil matter, so this is now going to go to the civil courts, and the victim can basically pay compensation, which they probably won't because they're a church-going family, so they probably don't want to sue the church. So it's one of those things where it's a gamble on both sides, and it's one of those. The DA's referred this case to the federal authorities, the state DA, because he felt he was justified to do so. And there are charges out there which technically, should have been dealt with probably in a different sense. I mean, maybe it would have been easier for this case to be dealt with in a federal sense, because even though a lot of the abuse occurred within DeSoto County, Mississippi, would it have been easier just to say, okay, let's be sensible about this. It's a hot topic right now. It's a hotbed of discussion. Let's refer this to federal authorities. Let's take this out of the state hands, and let's pull it up into the federal government's hands and let them initially prosecute. And maybe we'll look at, depending on what they do, we'll look at doing Whiteside on a state level afterwards for the crime she did commit in DeSoto County. I mean, it's still justice. Whether it's 20 or 30 years in a state penitentiary or 20 or 30 years in a federal penitentiary, it's still a punishment. Lindsey Whiteside would still be incarcerated. So maybe it could have been handled differently on that front. And that's not many people are saying that. I mean, Tony Freese has already gave a statement saying that this new legal step is un-American, and there is a sovereign argument here. Because there is case law which says this can happen, and it is going to happen. The DA is well within their rights to do this. And it's just one of those things where there's a lot of to-ing and throwing, and this is going to be one of those cases that really will grab the limelight and the public attention. So, my thoughts on all of this, Whiteside has admitted her guilt on a state level. She's obviously not done it on a federal level because there's something that we're not looking at. As I said, maybe her defense is going to be she didn't physically transport her on at least one of those occasions, because I know one of the charges does relate to a church trip. So maybe so maybe this is going to be turned back on the driver of the bus and the church themselves, or maybe the judges and the jury see through that and say, irrespective, it was Whiteside who was the abuser. It's going to be one of those. It's going to be a close one to watch. It's just going to be something close to watch, because it is going to be a lot of twists and turns. It's going to unfold just before Christmas of this year. It's December the 8th, I believe. She's up in court for trial as it's currently set. The defense attorneys could, or even the prosecution could, ask for a reset and go to another date after Christmas. My 2 pence worth is that she should have been given custodial sentence, and it should have been adequate and proportionate to what she did. Because again, I've got the foresight of looking at it from a different perspective, and in my mind, it should have been automatic 10 years for the grooming and the abuse, and then for each subsequent severity, it should have been given like a 5 or 10 year increment. And I think honestly, the victim, even though they asked for 30 years and the family asked for 30 years, because they did. I mean, the judge asked the victim and the parents of the victim, what would you see as a fitting sentence? And all 3 of them said 30 years. And the DA also said 30 years. But I think if the judge would have given, Whiteside 10 years or 15 years incarcerated, or even 20 years, I don't think it would have caused as much outcry as it did. So this one is firmly on the shoulders of the judge, awarding the sentence he did. And and I've had a conversation with a lot of people, and it's some people have said to me it was consensual. Some people have said to me this. It doesn't matter. She was still a minor. She's Whiteside still broke the law. It doesn't matter what technicality you got on this one, but on a federal level, it will come down, I think, specifically to a technicality. I really do. I think on this case, on a federal level, it will be a technicality case, and that's it, because that's the only option I can see. I mean, I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not a legal in any sense of the word. I'm just looking at this from a different perspective, and I've looked at it from a prosecution standpoint and a defense standpoint, and it seems that it's going to be a technicality. So yeah. Well, I think that's all we've got time for today. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please do like and share so I can get some subscribers and followers and everything else. Initially, this is going to be on Spotify, and we'll also be posting it on TVMO Media on Facebook. So please don't forget to give us likes and shares on there. Give us some traction, because this is all self-funded, and the more traction we get, the more money we make. And I don't want to turn this into a subscriber-based podcast. I don't want to make money off it that way. Just cover the costs. I would sooner cover the costs, from Facebook revenue and content revenue. So please do like, share, and subscribe. It'll also be on YouTube and the TVMO Media. The Ramblings of an Englishman. I think it's a pretty cool title, actually. I picked it myself. It will be a daily show. Weekends, I don't know yet. I might take a break on weekends, unless I wake up one Saturday morning and really feel like I've got to moan. But yeah, so as I say, like, subscribe, follow. Let's get some traction. Let's get this out there. And if you don't agree with my opinion, that's up to you. Any hateful remarks or anything like that, I'm not really going to bother responding to them. We're all adults. If you're gonna act like a child, go and sit at the kids' table. That's the way life is. If you can't agree to disagree, that's another part of life we've lost, is agreeing to disagree. Too many people have gone one way or the other, and now no one can be offended. And back in the day, I remember the good old days. God, I'm not even that old. But back in my day, if we had a problem with someone, we'd take them around the back of the block, and we'd have a punch up, and win, lose, or draw, we'd then go for a beer. Where these days, people are more aching to shoot or stab you, and God knows whatever else. So yeah. So thank you for listening. I'm going to stop droning on, and I say like, share, and subscribe. Let's get this out there, and tune in tomorrow for another dose of the Rambling Brit.